This is Dan Schneider, and this is another American TV with Mitchell Hadley. Mitchell Hadley is on the right side of the screen. Mitch, if you could just give a little background about who you are, and then we'll jump into talking about television westerns.
Sure, it's good to see you again, Dan. I'm a classic TV and pop culture historian. I write about classic TV at the website itsabouttv.com, and I'm also on Facebook and Twitter. And my latest TV book is called The Electronic Mirror. It takes a look at the relationship between classic television and American culture, history, and pop culture throughout the years.
So, television westerns. Let's speak just a little bit about the relationship between going back to the 19th century and the dime store western novels up through the movie serials, the
hmm
big budget movie westerns, and television westerns. Is that a natural progression of the format?
It is, yes. The popularity of westerns, whether it's as an adventure story or some kind of a morality play, has been around almost as long as the West was. And I'm sure that people have seen depictions of those dime store novels within Western movies themselves. So there was this aura about the West and about Westerns that was almost simultaneous with the West itself. So when moving pictures began, and of course, you had the proximity of Hollywood to the West in the first place, and Hollywood wasn't that well developed. California was only one of a number of places that might have become the movie capital of the United States. But it was natural that Westerns would be part of that. Westerns filled the screen. They were popular. They weren't necessarily easy to make, but you could make them on location. People were familiar with the characters. You had a lot of B westerns, you had western serials, you had western heroes, and so it was almost a given that when television began, that those westerns would find their ways to TV. And in fact, the first westerns that we saw on TV were edited versions of western serials or B movies that made it on. And if you look at TV in the late 40s throughout the 50s, you'll see that particularly on Saturday mornings and afternoons, TV's full of westerns, almost exclusively during those matinee times on Saturdays and even Sundays. The Western was the big form of television, and it was the entertainment that kids had on Saturday mornings. So it's no surprise that Westerns would become so fixed in the television prime time of the 50s and early 60s.
Um, when I mentioned the dime store novels and the films, there were basically two types of westerns within them. There were the dime store novels that were basically from the Civil War era on, and then around the turn of the 20th century, probably the first, or one of the first, if not technically the first, uh, truly literary westerns was Owen Wister's The Virginian,
hmm
and so you have a little bit of divide that you had people who were considered good writers like Zane Grey. Similarly, you had B films from the Silence up through the early 50s, I guess, and then you had higher end productions by people like John Ford or Howard Hawks. Uh,
Right.
was there a similar split in television shows? Because I know
Not,
I,
you know,
I know that the Lone Ranger was aimed at
mhm.
kids.
Yeah, not at first. If you look at the linear progression of TV westerns, the first big western on TV was Hopalong Cassidy, and that was William Boyd as Hopalong. Those initially came from the 60 plus movies that he had made, and then showing how well he had kept himself in shape over the years, he made new Hopalong Cassidy films for television to augment the 66 that he had made for the movies. So in current day, he was still playing Hopalong Cassidy. Remarkable when you think about it. But yeah, the early stars were people like the Lone Ranger, Roy Rogers, Gene Autry. They had comedy, they had music, they had shoot 'em ups with clearly defined good guys and bad guys, and they were mostly children's adventure stories. They had great marketing tie-in to children and to what they were able to sell them on cereal boxes and auxiliary types of things. I mean, if you've seen A Christmas Story, and I think a lot of people probably have at this time of the year, you've got the Red Ryder BB gun. Well, television was filled with that kind of tie-in through the first part of the 50s. So at that point in time, we're probably talking about the low Western, the one that's strictly there as adventure morality play, but morality play in a very loose sense that you had good guys and you had bad guys. But it's in the middle part of the decade that you see the transition where you get to more of what we could call the kind of John Ford Western, not with the sweeping panoramas particularly. They didn't work very well in black and white, but with the idea that you were dealing with more serious subjects. And the one show that's credited with being the debut of what came to be called the adult Western was The Life and Legend of Wyatt Earp with Hugh O'Brien. And that series had a number of things going for it. First of all, it was based on a real character. Wyatt Earp had become a legend, a hero. It was a recognizable name. People knew roughly who he was. Hugh O'Brien was a dynamic actor. He had real appeal for viewers. He wasn't a cartoonish type. He wasn't a singing cowboy. He was a serious actor. And what Wyatt Earp did in a number of ways to introduce the adult Western, it brought in real life characters and real life events, and it dealt with them in a fairly mature way. And it was one of the first shows to have what I would call a quasi-continuous storyline, because it followed Earp from his first days as a U.S. Marshal all the way up to the final episodes of the series, which involved the gunfight at the OK Corral. So you saw regular characters, you saw a progression, a clear-cut timeline where he moved out farther west toward the OK Corral. And particularly in the last season of the show, you saw the foreshadowing of what was going to come at the very end of the series. That was a quality adult Western. Now, not far behind that, you had another great Western that had evolved from radio, and that was Gunsmoke. And Gunsmoke was assuredly an adult Western. It was dealing with, as I think we've mentioned before, it was dealing with some very adult themes. You had prostitutes and bordellos and heroes who were conflicted. Matt Dillon, as played by William Conrad on the radio, was a conflicted hero. He had his obligation, but he would get fed up with it at times. He was discouraged that the citizens in Dodge City didn't support him more often than they did. And when he shot people, he often was put in a position where he felt that he had to do it more than he wanted to do it. And that was the model of Gunsmoke that came over to television with James Arness in the lead role. And it was a show that ran for 20 years. So it was obviously very successful.
Yeah, I remember as a kid, I remember Gunsmoke. I wasn't a big fan. That was the color days. This would have been probably 69 to 74 when it ended. And I remember about 7, 8 years ago, I was working a second shift job, and before I'd go in, there'd be an hour of gun smoke as well as then the riflemen. And I was surprised at how gritty, especially Gunsmoke, was. Then it really turned from I think, in fact, the very first episode, he's in a graveyard. Matt Dillon's in a graveyard, and he's looking down at up on a hill, looking down at the town, and it's just a very striking image. It reminded me quite a bit of a lot of the comic book westerns of the era that had sort of that, because in the 50s superheroes were on the way out, and it was the westerns, war comics, horror comics that were there, and it had that kind of almost gritty World War II kind of comic feel to it, which was far different from what it ended up with when I was a little boy seeing the new ones then. I wanted to ask, though, before we get too far afield,
Sure.
Regarding the 1950s and heroic characters, the one that came most to my mind was the Disney versions of Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone, which both starred Fess Parker. Now, those were I think, clearly aimed at children, were they not?
They were. They would deal from time to time with more adult themes, and particularly with Daniel Boone. You're talking about, I think, for the time, a fairly enlightened portrayal of Native Americans as being less cartoonish and more three-dimensional. But yeah, I would say you could almost say, and I know that those two are loosely considered westerns, but I almost consider them more adventure stories than pure westerns, because they don't deal with the traditional western backdrop the way some of them do. They share a time period, but they're in the frontier, whereas the westerns themselves tended to be the struggle of those frontier areas to become civilized and to eventually achieve their goal of statehood. And one of the reasons why law enforcement was such an instrumental part of these westerns is because before you could hope to become a state, or in the case of some of the larger communities, to become the territorial capital and later the state capital of the state. In order to be able to achieve that, you had to have some kind of law and order. You had to have the credibility that would be acceptable to become a state in the Union. And so the law enforcement official not only was there to enforce law and order, but he was also there to introduce a certain aspect of civilization, as we would know it, to make it plausible for Nevada territory or Montana territory or Oklahoma territory to eventually become a state. And that was, and I think that when you look at Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett, you're looking at an area slightly before, where they're in the transition from the frontier to the territory, whereas the other westerns would take it from the territory to the state.
Yeah, it's there's that thin line. I have two other shows that come to mind that probably technically aren't westerns because they're not adventure series, but more character based. I'm fast forwarding to the 70s here. The first one is Little House on the Prairie, which starred Michael Landon, who became famous in Bonanza. That's basically about a frontier family in Minnesota in the 1860s or 70s, whatever it was. And another one that comes to mind, on the surface, seems like it could have been the premise for a Western, but it probably falls more into the Daniel Boone category, and that's The Life and Times of Grizzly Adams.
Yep. I agree with you completely on both of those. They are considered, I think, if you look at the chapter in television history entitled Western, those would be considered quasi-Westerns. But I think they share a lot of the characteristics of a traditional Western, and that they're talking about this, if not a quest to conquer the land, a quest to be at one with the land, to live with the land, and to cooperate with it in terms of building something for the future. You've got these themes of rugged independence, faith in yourself and in your ability to, if not conquer the elements, to at least live in some kind of harmony with them. I think that in that sense, both of those shows very much fall into the mindset of the Western, even if they aren't exactly what we think of as a Western. If you were to insert Clint Eastwood, for example, or John Wayne into most of the TV Westerns that we talk about, it's a very comfortable fit. It's not such a comfortable fit to put them into some of these quasi-Westerns, but the characters in them display many of the same qualities.
Yeah, I believe it was John Weston who recommended Arness for the role of Matt
Hmm.
Dillon.
Yeah, it's not true that they offered him the role,
Yeah.
but it is true that he was a friend of Arness and recommended him and appeared at the very beginning of the very first episode of Gunsmoke to introduce it. And of course, Gunsmoke was only a half an hour drama at that point in time, but it proved to be so popular that when it expanded to an hour, much later in its run, the half-hour episodes continued to run on CBS. They went into syndication, but they also ran on CBS for a couple, 3 years, and they ran under the title of Marshall Dillon. So, in fact, you had an hour and a half a week on the network of Matt Dillon and his colleagues, two different titles, but the same evolution. And the show ran for 20 seasons. That tells you something about how long a lifespan, how much that show appealed to the public.
So you mentioned some other shows, but it seems to me that Gunsmoke was the definitive 1950s Western. Matt Dillon was the definitive hero. And like so many movie Westerns, especially the B serials, he tended to have a couple of goofy sidekicks over the years.
Yes, he had, first of all, Chester, who was played by Dennis Weaver. And uh, in the radio version, Chester is Indian heritage is played up just a little more. His name in the radio series was Chester Proudfoot, but he walked in the TV series with a limp. He was played very well by Dennis Weaver until Weaver tired of the role and wanted to get into something else, and then he was replaced by Ken Curtis as Festus Hagen, this more of a hillbilly type of character. And Festus had actually been introduced to Gunsmoke while Chester was still Matt Dillon's sidekick. He had been an occasional character in maybe half a dozen series or episodes.
Yeah.
So when he came on as a regular, it wasn't a completely new character or a complete introduction to the show. People did know who he was, but I think that he spanned, of course, into the hour-long episodes, into the color episodes. He became the one sidekick that was most closely identified with Matt, rather than Chester.
Yeah.
And you had Doc, Milburn Stone, you had Kitty, Amanda Blake, and then you had other characters, Burt Reynolds as Quint the blacksmith, who would come through now and again and last for a few seasons and go. But what I think distinguishes Gunsmoke in that sense is that it has a very strong supporting cast, and as the years would go by, those characters would take turns at times in being the lead in a particular story, and especially late in the run of the series, it almost became like an anthology in that the guest stars would dominate the story and the episode, and Matt and the other regulars would take on more secondary roles. That, in a sense, that Dodge City was merely hosting the story that was about to play.
Right, Dodge City almost became what the Love Boat was.
Yeah, in a more serious
Yeah.
context, yes. And the other thing that Gunsmoke began to do, which is very similar, I think, to science fiction, is that Gunsmoke particularly, and Bonanza, which we'll get into. But those two shows, because they were hour-long dramas and because they were successful and had long runs, had the ability to be able to tackle contemporary issues in the guise of a Western. So whether you were talking about discrimination, racial discrimination, or discrimination against women, or other aspects of what was becoming socially relevant content in the 60s and 70s, they were able to look at that in the same way that the science fiction series was, without drawing such direct parallels that they became controversial. And yet, at the same time, they were able to get a point across in a way that other shows weren't necessarily able to do.
Well, I want to talk about Miss Kitty for a moment because I think
Mhm.
she's an overlooked, an important character, not only in westerns but in the development of female characters in American
Yes.
television. Because number one, uh, her name Kitty is not as explicit as say the James Bond villainess Pussy Galore, but
Exactly.
as a
Yes. Uh-huh.
prostitute, you can make the parallels there. And while there were certainly episodes where she was imperiled, like the perils of Pauline and Matt saved her, they were not the predominant thing.
No.
She was someone who could stand up to. She could shoot a gun on occasion. She was not a 1950s housewife transplanted to the Old West.
Correct. And if you look at how she was portrayed in the radio to begin with, where it was a bit more explicit in the suggestion that she was at the very least a madam,
Yeah.
and everybody knew that she had a special relationship with Matt that the other women didn't. But you're right, she was tough. She was independent. She wasn't afraid to get involved in things, either on radio or television. And as the show goes on, she evolves from being a madam to a co-owner to the owner of the Long Branch, and she exercises all of the responsibilities and duties that a small business owner would have. So in addition to all these other things, I mean, she's not silly. She's very smart. She's very tough, and she never compromises her independence by putting herself in a position where she needs a man to have a successful life. She might want to marry and settle down, but she's not needy in that sense. And so I think she's a very bold, very strong character, and Amanda Blake portrays her brilliantly in that. It's really difficult to imagine anyone else as Kitty. And when she leaves the series, they wisely decided not to recast the role. So,
In my mind, other than Gunsmoke, probably the 1960s, which we'll talk about in a moment, is dominated by Bonanza, which sort
yeah,
of supplanted Gunsmoke as the top Western. And also the other important series is Maverick. But before we get to that, uh, 1950 specific television shows. Are there any others that come to mind that are very important?
yeah, I think that there are some that are important for one reason or another. We'll start with Cheyenne, which starred Clint Walker, and that was the first Western from Warner Brothers. That'll be significant in a moment. But Cheyenne is significant because it was not only the first hour-long Western, but it was also the first hour-long dramatic series of any kind that had continuing characters in it that lasted into a second season. You had had dramas before that were hour-long, although the predominant form back in the day was half hour. But you'd had hour-long dramas. They hadn't been successful. You'd never had an hour-long Western. And yet Cheyenne makes that accomplishment in both ways. It started as what we call a wheel program, which means it rotated with two other properties that Warner Brothers had. One of them was Casablanca, and the other was King's Row. Both very successful movies that did not successfully transition to television. Cheyenne, Warner Brothers owned the right to the title because they had made a movie called Cheyenne, but the TV series has nothing to do with the movie. Now, the other reason that Cheyenne is significant, the other reason I bring it up as part of its spot in TV history is because Clint Walker became involved in a contract dispute with Warner Brothers. Now, that didn't make him unique. Almost every player who was under contract to Warner Brothers at one time or another had that kind of a labor dispute. But when he walked off the series, he was replaced by another character, Ty Hardin. He wasn't Cheyenne. His name was Bronco. And when Walker eventually returned to Cheyenne, they spun Hardin off into his own series called Bronco. And then they added a third element, which was called Sugarfoot with Will Hutchins. And those three series operated as a wheel itself. It was under the overarching title The Cheyenne Show, but they would rotate Cheyenne, Bronco, and Sugarfoot on a regular basis. The reason this is significant is because it becomes a trademark of Warner Brothers in almost all of the shows they do at the time. Maverick, which you mentioned, had a rotating cast of leads. You had both James Garner and Jack Kelly as various Mavericks. And then when Garner got involved in a contract dispute with Warner Brothers, he was replaced by Roger Moore, and then he was a couple of other characters took over, and finally at the very end of the series, Kelly was the only Maverick left, and they filled out the series with some reruns of Garner episodes. But that's significant because Warner Brothers, when they branch out from westerns to private detective shows, they employ the very same concept. You have their great trifecta of 77 Sunset Strip, Bourbon Street Beat, Surfside 6. You also have the Roaring Twenties. And in all of those series, they successfully employ this concept of multiple leads so that while they may on occasion all appear in the same episode, one of them carries the episode. This enables them to shoot more than one episode at the same time and keep down on costs. And that becomes a trademark of Warner Brothers. Someday we should talk just about Warner Brothers and their involvement in TV, but that's where you see that come from. It comes from the Western, spins off into the detective series, and of course the Wheel series remains a concept on television through the 70s with various elements doing that. I think that there are a couple of other shows that we might want to mention in brief that are I think significant as we get more into this idea of the adult Western. The first one is Have Gun Will Travel with Richard Boone, and he plays this very mysterious character. His name is Paladin, no first name, just Paladin, and his logo, his brand, if you will, is the knight, the paladin chess piece. And his card, his business card, says exactly the title of the series, Have Gun, Will Travel. You hire him. He's more than a hired gun. He's a troubleshooter. He's a fixer. Sometimes he's hired to provide protection. Sometimes he is hired to escort people across dangerous territory. Sometimes he's hired to help out in a difficult situation that a landowner might have. He's a very tough character. He again does not like to use the gun, but he won't hesitate to use it if he has to. And he'll warn you of that right in the opening scene, the opening credits of each episode. But he's also a very learned man. He West Point, very stylish dresser, attends the opera, has an appreciation for fine food and fine arts. But when he goes to work, all of that is gone, and he dresses completely in black shirt, black pants, black hat. And a memorable character through 5 very successful seasons. The other show that kind of comes in that same way is Wanted, Dead or Alive with Steve McQueen. And McQueen plays a bounty hunter. And a bounty hunter with a heart, it might be said, because oftentimes in a compelling situation, he will give the bounty that he earns for bringing in a wanted criminal. He may donate that bounty to the aggrieved party or to someone who really needs it. But it is what it says. The drama in part of the series comes from McQueen's absolutely dynamic performance. You don't have to watch more than a few of the early episodes of this to say to yourself, this man is going to become a star. He just jumps off the screen. But also the fact that it Wanted, Dead or Alive. He doesn't have to bring in the bad guy alive. It matters not to him. So he's kind of the attitude, look, partner, whether I bring you in alive or shoot you dead, I still get paid the same amount. It's up to you as to how much trouble you want to cause me. And those two shows taken together are very good examples of that adult Western dealing with some serious things, dealing with conflicts where right and wrong is not necessarily as black and white, as cut and dried as they were in the adventure Westerns. And on occasion, a paladin in Have Gun Will Travel will find out that the person who hired him has lied to him. And in that case, he turns against the person who hires him. So there is a real code of honor, almost like latter-day samurai warriors, a real code of honor in these series that gives them staying power and relevance. And they hold up very well today if you watch them. Aside from the occasional situation where somebody will get shot in the hand because you didn't want to have too much violence in the show. Wanted, Dead or Alive, violent. Have Gun Will Travel. At the time it was on television, considered the most violent show on television. So these are not Hopalong Cassidy and Roy Rogers shows. And I think that it's important to stress that in looking at these, both in the development of Westerns and in the development of TV in general. And as I said, they're both available on DVD today. They both hold up very well, not only as Westerns, but as relevant dramas.
So you mentioned a couple of shows there where we're breaking away from the formula, and you had mentioned Maverick and the Wheel. I think that it's important to talk about James Garner's Maverick because he later then in the 70s had another hit show with the Rockford Files. I know I did a show on that. Did I do that with you? No. No. But talk a little bit about Garner's Maverick as the character within that, because for me, when I think of the show Maverick, I think of James Garner. The other fellow, he was okay.
Well, it's interesting because Maverick is the first Western that it's the first adult Western that you could say had a sense of humor. And the story goes that very early in the show's run, a bored scriptwriter had slipped in some stage instructions in the script that said that Maverick looked at somebody with his beady little eyes. And Garner thought this line was very funny, and he played the whole scene for laughs. And so eventually Maverick evolves into a series that is not an outright comedy. I don't think that you could watch an episode of Maverick and call it just a 1 hour situation comedy, but it is a light-hearted Western. It becomes famous for doing spoofs of other Western series. In particular, it did a memorable spoof of Bonanza with Jim Backus playing the role of Lorne Greene's family patriarch. And instead of the Cartwrights, they were called the Wheelwrights. And instead of Hoss and Adam and Little Joe, the three idiot brothers, were called Moose and Small Paul and someone else I can't remember with the third name. But they also did a spoof of Gunsmoke, where you remember in Gunsmoke, the opening credits, you almost always see Matt and this other guy headed for a showdown on Main Street, and they're facing each other. They're ready to draw. In the Gunsmoke spoof, Garner is facing his adversary, but they are about a block and a half apart from each other. You can barely see his opponent in the distance. He's that far away from Garner, and it's such a wonderful takeoff on that cliche-ish Gunsmoke beginning. But that's where Maverick goes. And the other thing I think that's important to mention is, particularly with Garner, but with Jack Kelly as well, you've got almost what we would call today an anti-hero. Garner does not want to get involved. He prefers running away from a situation to being shot. He's a professional gambler. He's there to make money. He's a card shark. He comes into town to get into a big game. When he gets involved in a situation, it's usually through no desire of his own. And what he looks to do is get in and get out of it as soon as possible, hopefully with as little bloodshed as possible, specifically his blood. And later on, Garner will play a very similar character in a series called Nichols, which only runs for one season, but it's very similar in that kind of character. You could say that Garner is playing himself. You could say he's playing the same character. Nichols is updated a bit. In this version of the West, the car has just been introduced, and so it is a West that is struggling to adapt to the 20th century and to the changes that come as a result of it. But in its heart, in its genesis, it's very much a progeny of Maverick.
So before we move on and talk about Bonanza and get fully into the 60s, I do want to speak on a couple of things. You mentioned how Steve McQueen popped off the little screen with How a Gun Will Travel. And it's interesting that some big movie stars of the 60s and 70s came from TV Westerns, whereas the big stars in those Westerns never made the transition. Two that come to my mind are Burt Reynolds in Gunsmoke. He was there for 2 or 3 seasons. He had a minor character that, as I recall watching it a few years back, as I mentioned, was fairly undeveloped. And then I guess he hit it big on the big screen. The other one is The Rifleman, was a very popular show with Chuck Connors.
Yes.
And Connors never really crossed over into the film.
No, he didn't. He maintained a marketable star on television throughout his career, but he never really did make much of an impact in film. And I don't know if he ever really tried to do too much in the movies. He was in a few, but his main oeuvre was TV.
And the third one I wanted to mention was, and I want to talk about the show too, Rawhide, which Clint Eastwood came from. And Clint Eastwood probably is the biggest Western star post John Wayne.
Yes, he was a co-star
Yeah.
on Rawhide, the actual star. Now Rawhide shares something with other westerns of the time, for example, Wagon Train, in that it is a show that is all about moving. And in Rawhide's case, it's about moving the herd. And the trail boss in Rawhide was a character named Gil Favor, played by Eric Fleming. He was the star of the show, and Clint Eastwood was one of the co-stars. And it was a very strong cast because you had a lot of popular characters in that show that would go on to make a lot of appearances, personal appearances through the years. But it's another situation where it verges on being an anthology in that it does not have a fixed location. As the trail moves on, they'll run into different towns and meet different people and become involved in different situations, whether you've got crooked businessmen or unscrupulous politicians or people who are being taken advantage of, and the men, the cowboys on the trail get involved with their various dramas. So it kind of straddles that line between an anthology and a regular series, but it's very good at showing the West, the very picturesque, again, black and white, but it's very naturalistic. It deals with some very harsh realities about what the West was like, whether it's violence or disease or drought. It does not romanticize the West much in that matter, and it also deals, of course, with some of the problems that you have with the Civil War, the post-Civil War period, because I think the Civil War had ended just a few years before the start of the show. So it's still dealing a bit with the reconciliation of the country and with what's happening with former Union soldiers, former Confederate soldiers, their readjustment and reintroduction to society. And in fact, Eric Fleming's character had been in the Confederacy, so you were looking at something you could never do today, really. It would be unthinkable for a television series to present a former Confederate soldier as a hero. Such is the cancel nature of society. He'd have to flagellate himself 1,000 times and renounce anything he'd ever believed in. But back then that wasn't an issue, and they did have shame, a sense of shame for having been involved in the war, for having done some of the things that they did. But it was also an era where you would have people struggling about that, very much like Vietnam would come to be later on.
So I was gonna wait a little bit to bring up this next show, but since you talked about the Civil War, you have to mention the show The Virginian. I'd mentioned
Yes.
Owen Wister's novel, which if anyone wants to read it, it is, I think, it truly is a great novel.
Hmm.
And the show is based on it, and I think over the years it went away from the original premise, but the main, if not the main character, but the character that the show is named after is this nameless character simply called or said to have been from Virginia, called the
Hmm.
Virginian.
Right,
And it,
James Drury.
yeah,
Yeah.
and it's set up in Cheyenne country. I think it's Wyoming. And so, can you talk a little bit about that? And also, we talked a little earlier about the difference between frontiersmen like Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett and westerns, but there's always, in my mind, been a difference between Texas, from Kansas to Texas, the southern part, and also the farther west in Arizona, and then northern western set in the Dakotas or Montana or
Hmm.
Wyoming. Uh, the Virginian, despite its name, is set in Wyoming. It's set up in the north, and so there is a difference at play from those where you'd have. There were less, for example, Jesse Jameses and Billy the Kids up north.
Exactly. That's exactly it. It's much more of what we might call a civilized area,
Yeah.
where you've already gone through that initial process of civilization, and so you've got whether you've got men who have become very important in business or in society, and you have them having reached a position of prestige, and success, and then you have the ranch where the Virginian works as the foreman of the ranch, and he has his top hand, Trampus, who's Doug McClure. And then you have that supporting cast. You have Lee J. Cobb as the first of the successful businessmen, and then I think later on you've got Charles Bickford and John Ireland. But the Virginian is comes in a slightly later time period, a slightly different setting. It's significant on TV for a couple of reasons. One, it's shot entirely in color. So it introduces that same element that we had talked about with John Ford, the ability to be able to capture some of the beauty of the West, that as well as the harshness. The Bonanza was also entirely in color, but that makes it unusual. And you also have, it's a 90-minute series, which is extraordinary on television. And because it was 90 minutes, it again became that kind of wheel series where different members of the cast would take the lead in the episode. It didn't mean to the exclusion of other members of the cast, but everybody had a chance to play in it. And because of that, their characters became pretty well evolved over the years. You saw young people growing up. You saw older young people maturing. You saw the effects of various things on them, and so that gave the show a real depth that some of these did not have. And you also had some outstanding guest stars in the Virginian. Again, that's the kind of a show that is going to have big name guest stars to be able to carry a 90-minute running time all the time. But I think the Virginia is a wonderful series. As you say, that the book is not only a great Western, it's a great work of literature. And it stands on its own in the same way that say Raymond Chandler didn't just write detective fiction, he wrote literature. And the Virginian, I think, is the same way. And you know, a personal anecdote about that. We were at a friend's house once and surfing through the dial, and the Virginian was on in one station. She wasn't familiar with it. She's more normal. She's not like us in getting into the history of TV. And so we had to have a little explanation of what the Virginian was about and who the Virginian was. And we saw about an hour of the 90-minute episode, and James Drury is not in it. That's one of the episodes where he doesn't play a significant role. So she would ask, "Is that the Virginian?" "Nope." "Is that the Virginian?" "Nope." "Nope." And get to the end, well, he wasn't in that. So we watch another episode. He's not in that one either. And so we managed to watch between 2.5 hours of the Virginian. She never once saw the Virginian or heard anyone refer to the Virginian. So it is an irony, but the fact that those two episodes were very good meant that that as good as James Drury was, and he was very good, the show did not have to have him in it. An individual episode did not require his presence in order to be successful.
So I want to just ask, and let's get into Bonanza, because as I said, it displaced Gunsmoke as the top show on TV. I think both of them had 3 or 4 year runs at number one.
Mm-hmm.
But Bonanza started in '59. Was it in color from that first season?
It was, yes.
Really?
It was a commitment that the network made that this show was going to be filmed in color from the very beginning. And so when you look at the DVD release of it, and they released the complete series a few years ago, which was a huge achievement in and of itself. But you look at those episodes from the very beginning, and the clarity and crispness and vividness of the images is astonishing. It is really something to see.
So most people would have seen the first few years at least in black and white and not seen
Yep.
them in color until I guess
Hmm.
VHS 20 some years later. So I've always thought, and we mentioned the Rifleman. That's about a widow who's raising a young son. I forget. It might be in California. I forget where, or maybe it's also Nevada. But I always thought Bonanza was two things. One, it was sort of the Rifleman times four. Although the Rifleman would have been one. I guess it was times three. It's the three main sons,
Yeah.
and yet he doesn't seem to have been as successful because the sons, like you said, parodied what Pernell Roberts' character was the only one who was, I think, consistently intelligent. And also, it reminded me years later when I saw Dynasty with John Forsythe. He's an oligarch basically. Lon Green's
Yeah.
character. He owns this huge ranch, and he's wealthy. He's the Elon Musk of that time and place almost.
Yeah, it's very interesting that when you look at the when you look at the premise, you've got these three adult males, all with three different wives or mothers, because Ben Cartwright had been married three times. Each of his wives died, and so each of the brothers had a different mother. And when Pernell Roberts left the series after a few seasons, um, one of the reasons he gave for that was that he was finding the episodes starting to become very stale. There was, he felt, no character development. And in particular, he thought that it was absurd that these men, grown men, were still taking orders from their father and trying to please him as if they were in their teens. He found that implausible. The flip side of that, the defenders of the series, Michael Landon, for example, pointed out that in that time period, the ranch was the family business. And they were all involved in the family business. It wouldn't be a surprise that they would be still living on the Ponderosa, that they would still be involved in what's going on. It's the family business, and Pa Cartwright is the CEO and president of the business. So you can look at it a couple of ways. I always preferred Gunsmoke to Bonanza myself for some of those reasons, but all of the characters, in a way, became very popular with viewers in different ways, I should say. It's no surprise that they were popular, but you're right. Adam was very handsome. He was the very intelligent. He was charismatic. Easy to see why females would like him. Haas, who was Dan Blocker, was a bit dim, but he was a heart as big as the outdoors, you might say. And also, he could be very tough and provide a lot of muscle when called upon, but he wouldn't use that to his advantage if he wasn't a bully about his strength. He was reluctant to use it, but would use it when necessary. And then Little Joe, being the youngest of the three, was kind of the character that women wanted to mother. at the beginning. And of course, he grew up into being a much more dynamic part of the show when it's just the three of them. And Michael Landon becomes more involved in writing and directing the show itself. You see the three of them start to become a bit more equal in certain ways. But it it, as I say, it wasn't my favorite of the westerns, but it did have a long run. It taught a strong family dynamic. It's certainly not hard to see why it would appear in later years in syndication and on DVD as being part of a family-oriented type of programming schedule, and it instills those certain values that are consistent with the time. The problem that Bonanza encountered was that through time, Dan Blocker, who plays Hoss, became by far the most popular member of the show. Even though people loved Michael Landon and loved Lorne Greene, Dan Blocker was the heart of the show. And when Dan Blocker died prior to the show's final season, he was irreplaceable. And the show limped along, I think you could say, for another season. It changed its theme song. It changed the night of the week that it was on. And it didn't work. It did not work without him. And the sad part about that, as Lorne Greene would go on to discuss later on, the sad part of it all is that they were never told that the show was on the precipice of being canceled. So not only were they not given a chance to try to rectify any problems, they were denied the opportunity to be able to do a final episode, which he said that after all that time, they most certainly would have wanted to do if they'd had the chance to just kind of tie things up a little bit. And they never got to do any of that. The show was very abruptly canceled by the network, even though I think it could have continued on at least until the end of the season. But in a way, you can identify some of these westerns of the era with being part of the rural purge, too. If it did have viewership, it was the wrong kind of viewership.
Very much like Maverick, once Pernell Roberts left, there was like floating cousins that came in, and, someone who was vaguely related. It suffered from almost what would later become called the Cousin Oliver syndrome on the Brady Bunch.
There are all kinds of people that come through that are in one way or another connected with the family, and of course you have Hop Singh, whom I forgot to mention, who is the houseboy. I suppose we might call him almost a valet, but he's part of the family in a certain sense as well. But there are all kinds of people come through the Ponderosa, good and bad, everyone a different story. It's kind of like the Naked City, there are 8 million stories in the Ponderosa. This is one of them.
So I wanted to talk a bit now about sort of the mid to late 60s, when it seems to me, just looking back on it, the cracks in the fundamental Western that was portrayed in Hollywood films by John Wayne were starting to crack. Just as in film we started getting spaghetti Westerns, the Westerns was trying to evolve, trying to push their limits. And I want to talk about a few of these shows. Number one, I mentioned how Bonanza, I thought, was sort of like almost like a dynasty kind of show set 20 years earlier.
The Cartwright dynasty.
But actually, the first show that seemed to be explicitly a Western soap opera seemed to be The Big Valley.
Yeah, I think that's a good description. And The Big Valley is an interesting series in that the head of the family, it's a matriarch. Yeah. It's not Ben Cartwright. It's not any of the strong male leads that we've seen in these other shows. It's Barbara Stanwyck. And she is tougher than all of her sons perhaps put together, but has tremendous charisma about her. No question that she's the star of the show. But you've got the sons again, and you have the added dynamic that one of the sons is illegitimate. So we're not only talking about different mother, we're talking about different family. And you have a daughter, and you have shows that are going to revolve around the family in a different way than they do in the patriarchal series that we have. It was nonetheless very successful, but I think you're right that it is showing a bit more of an evolution. One of the sons is a lawyer, so you have that aspect of the series. One of the sons, the illegitimate son, is always trying to prove himself that he deserves the name Barclay, and so he's trying to do something. Linda Evans, speaking of Dynasty, Linda Evans, who plays the daughter, goes through many of the coming of age type stories that are familiar to soap operas. So I think you're right that the Big Valley, and to a lesser extent the High Chaparral, try to capture that kind of change in the zeitgeist, perhaps, of what television is showing. They're becoming more character driven than story driven, and we can probably get into this too. Part of it is a response to the increasing number of complaints about violence on television. And I think that because of the violent content of Westerns, almost by definition, by the end of the 60s and the end of the assassination era, you see a situation where the Westerns are almost forced to become more character-driven, more soap opera-ish, if you will. And that didn't always mix well with the Western genre itself. And as the rural purge happens, as Westerns become seen as old-fashioned, and the values that they impart are seen as old-fashioned, you see the Western dwindle away. One of the things we didn't mention when we talked about how popular Westerns are, and it's very difficult to explain to someone who's not familiar with the times exactly how popular they were. At one time, there were 30 Westerns on television. At one time. None of them had been canceled from the previous season. Probably a dozen new Westerns had been added to the schedule. Yes, you could have 30 Westerns because the dominant form of the time, again, was the half-hour drama. But still, to have 30 examples, to think of television today. If you had 30 soap operas, or if you had 30 police dramas, well, you might have 30 versions of NCIS or CSI, I'm not sure. But imagine a schedule that dominated by a particular genre, and you can see how popular the Westerns were. But by the end of the 60s, you're almost down to nothing. And then you hit the last two Westerns, Death Valley Days and Gunsmoke, and when they end in the very early mid-70s, 1975, there are no Westerns on TV. The slack has been picked up by police dramas, private detective dramas, and family dramas, gritty dramas, legal dramas, all sorts of other genres that have taken the various elements that were present in the Western and applied them to the times in different ways.
I wanted to talk about the few Westerns that were not averse to having minority characters on it. And I just, in looking over, I was surprised. I saw that The Lone Ranger had a 1966 series. This obviously is after Jay Silverheels as Tonto, and the was it? There were two. I think there were two main Lone Rangers. Do you know anything about that single year show?
I know that I think, now don't hold me to this, but I think that the 1966 version may have been an animated version.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Because I know there was one in the 60s that was made for Saturday morning television,
Okay.
and my guess would be that that's it, because I don't really recall another live action version of the Lone Ranger until they had that hassle with Clayton Moore being prevented from wearing the
Yeah.
mask and those kinds of stories. So I'd be willing to bet that's probably the cartoon.
And were there any other characters other than Tonto that were featured prominently? Native American characters. You mentioned Hop Sing,
Mhm.
who is occasionally, a secondary, tertiary character. Were there any westerns that were based from the point of views of Native Americans, for example?
Well, you had a series like Broken Arrow, where you had a western, where you had supposed Indians in the lead, although the actors themselves were simply made up to to look like Indians. But by and large, the way that Native Americans were portrayed on television was dependent on the show itself. In other words, beyond being the lead characters, most of the time you would see them being supporting characters. And the view expressed toward the Native Americans would depend on the character itself, so that the closer the character was to the leading characters, the more likely it was that the series would have an enlightened view of them. I mentioned Nichols earlier as one of the neo westerns that came along. That went so far as to have Native American characters who had graduated from Ivy League universities. So there was no sense that the Indian was an inferior character. Another series that comes to mind from the late 60s called The Guns of Will Sonnet, which ran for 2 years and was kind of a Western version of The Fugitive, in that it involved a former gunman and his grandson looking for the gunman's son, the grandson's father, who had left the boy in his care and gone on. Walter Brennan was the star of that, and one of the things he had been when he was in the cavalry, he had been an Indian scout, some other things like that. That presented, I think, a pretty positive, although probably cliched version of Indians. But I could be overlooking something fairly obvious, but to me, a show like Broken Arrow is the one that first comes to mind. When you brought up the topic of casting, the first show I actually thought of was a series called The Outcasts that was on television, I think in the late 60s, 68, 69, somewhere around there. And that was a Western that starred Don Murray and Otis Young. And Otis Young was the first black actor to ever play a co-lead in a Western. So that was very enlightened casting for the time. And it brought to light a part of history that has not often been dealt with in entertainment, either in movies or on television, which is the role that blacks played in the West. They were, of course, out there trying to blaze their own trails, especially in the period after the Civil War. So the hook of the Outcasts was that you had Don Murray, who was a former slave owner, and you had Otis Young, who was a former slave, and they are now bounty hunters in the 1870s, and they kind of enter into this uneasy alliance. They weren't really friends, but they had settled into a peaceful coexistence to be able to do their job. and each one of them complemented the other in a certain way. It was a bold attempt to make the Western genre more relevant. That was actually the first one that I thought of. When you go into the High Chaparral, you see the accent moving more from the Native Americans to the Spanish as you get into that part of the country. But again, it is trying to introduce a minority in there with some of the lead characters and to try to at least correct some misinterpretations or misrepresentations of this particular dynamic that we might not have seen in the earlier days of television.
You mentioned the Western version of The Fugitive.
Hmm.
I seem to recall, I could be wrong, didn't Gene Roddenberry before Star Trek try a Western with a lone?
Yeah, I think he did. I don't remember the title of it, but I know that Gene Roddenberry wrote some scripts for some of the Western series. I think he did a number of them for Have Gun Will Travel.
Okay.
And certainly in the episodes that he writes, you can see his hand right away, because they tend to be episodes that deal with moral issues or moral dilemmas or very thinly disguised versions of contemporary issues. So it has sort of a Star Trek-ish quality, some of those. But then, of course, Star Trek itself was supposed to be wagon train in space. So it's clear that that Roddenberry had an affinity for Westerns. And I think you're probably right about the Western that he developed. I don't remember it off the top of my head.
Now, probably the most well-known Western or quasi-Western that had a minority character was David Carradine's Kung Fu, although he was a yellow-faced.
But, yep, same idea though. An underrepresented minority being the lead in the series, and Kung Fu is yet another adaptation of the Western. You know, we've talked about the contemporary Westerns, we've talked about Westerns that have dealt with various issues as they assimilated into the time in which they were shown. Kung Fu was what one historian called the philosophical Western, almost an existential Western, because it dealt with a lot of issues that are very unusual in the contemporary Western, or in the Westerns of its time. It was very contemporary in that outlook, and there was no question that it was a Western, but it did again blaze a new trail from what we were used to seeing on TV, with a very interesting star.
And interestingly, I didn't know this until I looked up Kung Fu, that Carradine had also been in the TV version of Shane in the Alan Ladd role.
Yes. That didn't run for very long. As I recall, the premise of the TV series was that the patriarch, the father of the family that Shane had helped out, had died. He was no longer in the picture. So you had his wife, who was played by Jill Ireland, and then you had the boy who had always said, "Come back, Shane," and then you had Carradine as Shane. And I don't know. I've never seen a full episode of it. I have seen bits and pieces, plus I have seen the opening title sequence, and I don't think Shane was necessarily a good choice for a movie to adapt into a series, nor I think was the Cowboys, the John Wayne movie that they made into a series.
So I saw that there was a TV show titled The Legend of Jesse James, and if you look through, you see a few other minor outlaw types that were given their shows. Do you know anything about that show? Was that a show glory? Because not only was Jesse James a murderer and a crook, but he represented the very worst of the Confederacy.
Yes.
So was he made a hero in that show?
He sort of was. You know, that is a real example of a show that was of its time. It presented Jesse before he became as big of an outlaw as he was. So what he was the young rebel, the misunderstood young man. And his closest friend was, I think on the other side of the law, they did this kind of thing with Billy the Kid too. But you got them at a point in time where they're really, he's a good boy at heart. He's just misunderstood, and I think that was an attempt to try to capture the youth zeitgeist of the '60s and capitalize on this idea of the younger generation as rebelling against what they saw. So he wasn't really an outlaw. He was just a rebel.
So the late '60s, early '70s. I want to bring up two more, and then you can bring up any shows we've overlooked.
Sure.
Two shows that stand out in my mind as being examples of 1960s to early '70s carrying over the whole high concept thing. We had a few high concept westerns. The most obvious one was the Wild Wild West
Yeah,
with Robert
steampunk
Conrad.
western. Yeah.
Yeah, before I think steampunk was even coined.
Exactly. That just as so many of these westerns created the cliches, they didn't capitalize on cliches. They created them, and I think the Wild Wild West created steampunk in that way. Love that show. It had two dynamic leads. You had Robert Conrad was the more traditional hero, but then you had Ross Martin, who was the master of disguise, and who as an actor as well as a character kept kept Jim West grounded. Robert Conrad's the kind of actor that if you're not careful can very easily take over and dominate a series completely, and he can almost become unlikable in the process because he can be very strong-willed, and Ross Martin was kind of a grounding influence on him. He lightened the mood a little bit. He was able to make West more likable to other people, and Robert Conrad himself would say that. But you're right. That is James Bond in the Old West.
Yeah, and actually, I thought of a third show that's going to lead into the other show that I had on my mind. And I think it might be the only example of full-on Western comedy in the '60s is F Troop.
Yeah.
Uh,
There was an unsuccessful show called Rongo, I think it was, or
okay.
Rango, with Tim Conway. But, and he played an inept Texas Ranger. And what it really was, that was McHale's Navy in the Old West, but only the part of McHale's Navy that involves Tim Conway. But yeah, F Troop, which I think is a very funny series, presents an entirely revisionist view of the West, that neither the Indians nor the cavalry want to engage in anything approaching war, primarily because it's going to cut down on their ability to engage in their various nefarious money-making schemes. And so you've got Forrest Tucker playing a Western version of Bilko,
Yeah.
and you have Larry Storch, who I think makes the series
Oh yeah.
work as his sidekick, and you have these wonderful characters in the playing the Indians, Edward Everett Horton and some others who play them completely the opposite of what you would expect. And I would agree with you that that is probably the most successful example of what at the time was probably the only good Western comedy that's ever been. There have been a few since then, but I think that was the prime. And it only ran 2 seasons,
Yeah.
but it should have run longer. And somebody has done a really good analysis. Hal Horn, I think you've had him on the show before, has done a really good analysis of why the ratings for F Troop really justified it being brought back for a 3rd season. So
Yeah.
it was a better series than just a 2-year run.
Yeah, and I still remember to this day. I mean, my dad loved Larry Sorge. They were basically a bunch of old vaudevillians
Yep.
there, And I remember he always had a cousin, Larry Storch. I think there's 4 or 5 episodes. And my favorite one was his cousin from Canada, the burglar of Ban.
Yeah. I love that show. I think that's great fun.
But that leads me in because Forrest Tucker, if we're talking about influence, Forrest Tucker then joined up with in the early '70s with Bob Denver to do basically Gilligan's Island in the Old West with Dusty's Trail, which was a syndicated show.
Yes, and that also bore some resemblance to another Bob Denver series that I'm trying to think of, where he played a partner of somebody else in a.
It was the Real Ghostbusters.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
No, that was Larry Storch and Forrest Tucker.
Yes, but the Bob Denver had been in a series called The Good Guys. That's it. Okay. And this followed in the trail of that. And I think it shows how difficult it is.
Whoops. I can't hear you. You just blanked out, did you?
There we go. How's that?
Yeah, now I can hear you.
Okay, yeah. Hit the mute button. There are people out there who would wish I did that more often, but I think it shows that it is that it is difficult to do a comedy western, and that you have to have the right people in place, which is why James Garner succeeds so well, not only in the TV work he did, but when he did Support Your Local Sheriff and Support Your Local Gunfighter for the big screen, which essentially were satires of westerns as well. If you're going to make a western comedy, it almost has to be a satirical version.
Yeah, well, yeah, like what was the one by Mel Brooks, Blazing Saddles?
Oh, Blazing Saddles, yeah.
So let's talk then. What have I? Is there anything that any points or any shows that were neglected so far that you want to bring up?
Well, I think if we want to get into the idea of overlooked westerns when they were trying to resuscitate the genre. In the early 70s, you had a show like Alias Smith and Jones, which is a western mostly in the sense that it takes place in the West, and it tries to capture, I think, on the Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid kind of idea of these partners. But they've gotten apart and they have to stay out of trouble, something like that. You've got a show like The Barbary Coast, which is really a takeoff on the Wild Wild West, with Captain Kirk as Artemus Gordon from the Wild Wild West. He becomes the master of disguise, and I know Shatner really loved that show, and I think it was a good show, but I think it was not a show of its time. Then I think you probably have to look at how they have tried to resuscitate the Western, both in the movies and on television. And one way they have tried to do that is through the made-for-TV movie. The Sam Elliott did a number of those. Tom Selleck did some of them.
Lonesome Dove.
Lonesome Dove is the miniseries, yes, and then the series that was based on a series like The Magnificent Seven, which came along much later. But those are really what I would call classic westerns, because they are time appropriate. They are not particularly trying to deal with contemporary issues in the guise of a Western. They are very much fit into that classic genre of the Western. Then you have the revisionist Westerns, which I would say would be based off of some of Eastwood's later big screen movies, where you're talking about a West where the good guys aren't necessarily good and the bad guys aren't necessarily bad, and it turns out to be a pretty rough time. But as far as TV goes, I think the best revisionist Western you might have had was one that came along early on in in the Fox network run, which was The Adventures of Briscoe County
Oh
Jr.
yeah, yeah.
And that is, I think, the natural successor of both Maverick and the Wild Wild West, in that it was steampunk, almost verging on science fiction. It was also a spoof of Western cliches, and it had the maverick sensibility that nobody wanted to get hurt, and therefore you saw a lot of people who either suddenly had a change of heart and surrendered, or they got shot in the hand.
But then it also wasn't that also Briscoe County influenced by the Police Squad type of humor, Sledgehammer,
Hmm.
those shows.
Yeah, it Briscoe County would you could never call it a drama, and I think there are people who would even consider Briscoe County to be more of an adventure than a Western series. But I would call it a Western with a tongue in cheek. But it's a delightful series. And again, it's another series that deserved to be on for longer than it was. And but one of the highest compliments I can give to a TV series is to say that it is clever. And Briscoe County was a very clever series, I think.
So uh, those revisionist kind of westerns, there was no television version of say McCabe and Mrs. Miller kind of thing. There was no Lonesome Dove itself didn't really generate anything beyond
No,
itself. And even spaghetti westerns, speaking of Eastwood, um, they they never really made inroads into television series.
no, there's somebody interestingly enough that when we were talking about the Virginian, the final season of the Virginian was renamed The Men from Shiloh.
Mm.
And somebody, I'm not necessarily agreeing with them, but somebody said that that was essentially trying to make inroads into a spaghetti western. They were
Mm.
trying to change the format of the show more into that. I'm not sure if I agree with that or not, but it's worth discussing. I would say that you saw something like Walker Texas Ranger.
Mm.
Now that's a neo-Western.
Yeah.
Some people would say, yeah, it's really just a crime show set in the West. Cades County was a crime show set in the West. The advantage Cades County had was that it had Glenn Ford in it, and Glenn Ford was already closely identified with Western movies, so it had credibility as a Western series. But
But
I don't think you can.
that's like calling McCloud a western because it had Dennis Weaver and he wore a cowboy
Right,
hat.
right. And there are people who would classify it that way. I am not one of them. You are not one of them. I think that I think that when you try to update the Western genre, you have real trouble. Um, the hard Westerns, when we're talking about something like McCabe and Mrs. Miller, what you're really looking at are the westerns that are made in the era of prestige television when you're looking at cable and HBO. And so you'll see some shows like, well, a lot of people would talk about Yellowstone as a western. I think that's a neo-western, but a show like Justified that has some kind of vigilante elements to it. Deadwood, which definitely is a western, but it is not like any kind of a western that TV would have seen prior to that. So you do have examples of them, but they are not on the commercial networks. So you're looking at the Western having to head over into a different milieu altogether in order to be able to succeed as a revisionist Western.
I'm wondering though if the western as a form, even if it were, highly sponsored by a cable show like the way Mad Men or The
Hmm.
Sopranos was. I mean, does that horse still even run? It's like how much can I mean? Unless we're talking about you're doing a more realistic version of the
Yeah.
Cartwrights, not soap operatically,
Hmm.
not doing the disease of the week or the social issue of the week, but really showing what uh, you know pioneers, frontiersmen,
Yeah.
or even if it was set in a Native American setting with a Native American family and a white family or something.
Yeah, I agree. You can do movies from Louis L'Amour's books. You could not, I think, today do a Louis L'Amour TV series.
Yeah.
I think that what you would need in order to make a Western successful today, and now what will be very interesting is that there is talk that in the next few years we may see a renaissance of the stronger family values and traditional type of television. I'm a skeptic myself, but I think that the political situation certainly suggests in the eyes of some that we might see something like that. And if we do, then the Western is going to be the kind of a genre that we're going to see on TV, and we'll be able to tell whether that horse still has legs. My own personal belief, as somebody who has watched a lot of TV and a lot of Westerns. My own thought is that you probably can't revive that unless you take out a lot of the elements that made the Western a Western. In other words, you look at a show like Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman. Is that a Western? Well, I suppose, but what it really is a female Marcus Welby back in the frontier days. And I don't use these descriptions to cast aspersion on them, but almost all of these shows can be linked back to something else. And I think what you would have to do if you were going to do a traditional Western that was not set in contemporary times, but was set in the past, you're going to have to find some kind of a hook that gets it away from chasing down the bad guys, from having the horses and the ranches and something like that. And if you get that far away, do you really have a Western? I don't know. There was a Western we didn't mention, a single season Western called Whispering Smith around 1960 that Audie Murphy starred in. And it was very loosely based on the movie of the same name. But the reason I bring that up was that was set in Denver, which is it was set in the city of Denver after Colorado had become a state. So it's a little, to begin with, is a little different. And what's more different is that Audie Murphy is not a deputy. He's a detective. And his boss is not the sheriff. He's the chief of police. And so what they tried to do with that was bring the Western into the sensibility of the police procedural. It was very good, actually, primarily because of Audie Murphy, but also because that worked as a police procedural. There was a more interesting version even of that on the NBC mystery movie, Heck Ramsey. When Richard Boone came back into the Western genre, and that was about Western crime fighting at the time when things like fingerprints and other types of scientific and forensic studies were starting to become part of crime fighting. So that was the struggle to get the West to adapt to modern crime fighting technology. I think you would have to have perhaps something like that, where you're looking at something clearly set in the West, but a more contemporary version of the Old West.
Have you seen? I saw that the Walton's television show was rebooted on cable, and I don't know how it plays out versus the classic with Richard Thomas.
That would be interesting.
But that plus also a few nights ago I watched a film called The Green Knight from 2021. It's based on the poem Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and it stars actually an Indian actor as Sir Gawain. And the interesting thing about that is it's gritty. It's dark in terms of its look, but it isn't dark in terms of its outlook. It's sort of taking the King Arthur stuff, which then became J.R.R. Tolkien, which then became the what is it, the big show that was just went off a few years ago on cable. What was it, the
Game of Thrones? Not Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones, yeah.
Okay.
And so it's taking that and coming back and then sort of
Mm-hmm.
taking the old stuff and putting it through the meta versions of itself.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. It was a very good movie. I wouldn't say it was a great movie. The ending changes from the pump. But I'm wondering if maybe the only way I could see that the Western comes around is, one, is if we rebooted Gunsmoke or you rebooted Bonanza, but made Bonanza more realistic, grittier, darker,
Mm-hmm.
in the sense, not in terms of anti-heroes or stuff, but you know how Bonanza and even Gunsmoke, you always had those fake, outdoor scenes where they're
Yes.
sleeping at night.
They call them four-wall westerns,
yeah,
I think.
this would have to be where we're dealing with things. You'd have to have allow characters to use things like the N words or stuff to get a real sense of the time and place. You'd have to have maybe midway plan, sort of like Babylon 5. Plan that midway through the series, one of your lead characters is going to die.
Yep.
Make it realistic like that, rather than, in other words, take the Western from its television Robin Hood phase and make it more, gritty, but not gritty just that it's downbeat, but
Right.
just realistic.
Well, I think, to bring our conversation full circle, at the beginning I talked about the Western being a morality play, and it always has been. And if you look at a great Western movie like High Noon, which was really kind of an allegory of the blacklisting,
Yeah.
High Noon presented that kind of morality play. A show like The Prisoner, even though we're talking about something that gets into science fiction, The Prisoner did an episode that was set in the West, and it dealt with those same kinds of issues. And so I think you're right that one of the ways a Western can succeed in the Old West, in its time period, is if it returns to that idea of the morality play, not a superficial good and evil like you'd see in Hopalong Cassidy or Roy Rogers, but one that deals with those darker ideas that you're talking about and deals with how absolutely cruel those times actually could be when you're fighting Indians, you're fighting the weather, you're fighting the terrain, you're fighting starvation, and you're doing it from the point of view of also having to deal with a lot of people who are not what we would consider civilized. It's very, and you look at the best Westerns always succeed in capturing that harsh environment that the story takes place in. So I think you're right that it has to bring that element in. It has to deal with very adult themes and adult takes on them, and but at the same time it has to be loyal to and consistent with its time period to truly be a success in the way we're talking about it. In other words, we're not talking about something like the Wild Wild West or Briscoe County. We're talking about something that's a little more grounded in its time period, but that is dealing with the issues that we generally consider to be timeless issues. Shakespeare probably could have written a great Western, and I'm sure there are stories like that could easily be converted into Westerns and could be incorporated into a series. But it's got to have some of these elements that you've mentioned as well, or else it is not going to work.
Well, I guess we'll leave it at that, and that's the final show for this year, 2024. Next year we'll bring you some more shows on television history. So
I can't wait.
All right. Well, we'll be back in a month's time then.
Great, and I just Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, Happy New Year to all of you out there, and look forward to seeing you next year.